This is a narration by Daniel Marr to replace the sermon on creation, myth or miracle. When I was in year 9, I had to decide what I wanted to study. They gave me a big careers book. I really liked history and was good at it, and I was okay at science. I decided that there was no future in history and went for science instead. You can tell what our society values by how much the government subsidises science over history, and I picked up on that. When I went to study science, I avoided biology because I didn't want evolution. Instead, I studied chemistry, physics, maths, and picked an elective, which turned out to be earth and planetary sciences, geology essentially. As it turned out, they try to convince you of evolution in biology, but in geology, they don't. They know you believe it. It was kind of like studying theology for a godless church. One thing that you would understand, I often heard when I talked about my faith, was that science can't be true because the Bible can't be true because the first 2 chapters in Genesis are a myth. Now, myths can actually be quite meaningful, but as Adventists we're often uncomfortable with myths, and so this to us is quite an insult. And this is an example of why. In John 8:32, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." As Adventists, we find the truth very important, and we don't want to accept a comforting lie in its place, or a comforting tradition. We want the truth. And because we care so much about the truth, the idea of having a feel-good myth in the Bible is not appealing to us at all. So here's a quote from someone else who doesn't like myths. "There are all sorts of things that would be comforting. I expect an injection of morphine would be comforting. But to say that something is comforting is not to say that it's true." So as Adventists, we agree with this. This sounds like a good statement about truth. But who actually said this? Well, it wasn't an Adventist, it was Richard Dawkins, the leader of the New Atheists. In fact, not just an atheist, much more than an atheist. In fact, Dawkins is a sort of a modern apostle of Stoic philosophy. He is a master preacher for a godless church. I think we've made a mistake simply trying to prove our faith and disprove evolution, because what Dawkins does is not so much to try to prove that God doesn't exist. He assumes God doesn't exist and then goes on to explain how that can be better for our lives. And he claims that it's not the truth. With the creation-evolution debate, we've actually had some success. As Adventists, we began the debate, we began the movement to argue for creation science, and now there's a lot of people, especially in America, who actually accept creation. So there are 2 main points that I want to hone in on that Dawkins preaches. The first one is that God is not real, and the second one is, even if he was real, he wouldn't care about someone as unimportant as you. Just look at the gigantic universe, all the wonderful things, creator of all that. Why would he care about something as insignificant as you? And so these are the claims, and he says, you just have to accept this hard truth, and you need to grow up and be willing to live your life and find your meaning without having some sort of a belief in a God. So it's interesting that Dawkins takes this angle, because in the Bible we see a similar angle but very different direction. Hebrews 11 verse 6, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him." The Bible makes the opposite 2 claims. God is real, and he is a personal God who cares about us and wants to make miraculous interventions in our lives. The Bible teaches us to accept these beliefs by faith. So why are people like Dawkins so confident that the Bible is not true? And it's because they believe that science is the key to discover truth. So first, I think the most important thing is we need to work out what is science. So I've got the Google definition of science here, and it's an interesting definition. Science is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behaviour of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. You don't necessarily need to understand all of that definition. The keywords that I want to look at, really, keywords that have been subject to a High Court ruling in America, are these ones: physical and natural. So physical and natural means that you cannot have a scientific explanation that includes a supernatural or divine being. And the reason for this is because there was a conflict in America over creation being taught in science classes, and they wanted to ban that. So they redefined science as excluding any supernatural element. It didn't really change the way science was done, though, because science has always only looked for physical and natural explanations, but it did allow the science classroom to be preserved as a propaganda machine for atheism. So the real point, though, that I really don't want you to miss is science is defined to exclude God. So even if science found evidence for God, it could not acknowledge God, it could not discover God. It would have to exclude him until they found a better, quote-unquote, explanation, and in other words, an explanation that didn't discover God. So it's a bit like, it's not only science is not looking for God. If science saw him, it would shut its eyes tightly until he went away. So the idea that science has disproven God is actually a complete absurdity. It's impossible for science to be allowed to prove God, so how can it disprove God? By definition, that's stupid. So let's try to understand why science is not willing to see God in anything. Matthew 12:38-40. This would be the kind of text that we would tend to go to. The idea that rebellion actually comes from within, and then it leads to skepticism in wanting more proof, wanting more evidence. And this is true for a lot of people, but there are many Christians who are scientists. In fact, there are many scientists who believe God's word and creation. So how can it be? It can't be just that they're all a bunch of rebels. There must be something else to it. So here we have a contrast between science and Christianity. Now the contrast that's typically used is between science and religion, but I think that's a bit unfair in the sense that you can obviously compare science to most religions and it will come up favourably, because most religions are full of nonsense. Okay, so I just want to compare science and Christianity. And first of all, let's have a look at science. What is the purpose of science? It's to know how things work and what things are as well. What is the method that science uses? You observe, you make a guess about what you think you're seeing, then you check the guess, look for evidence to support it, and then you repeat the experiment over and over again. That's the scientific method in very much of a nutshell. What does science require in terms of its presuppositions? It requires a faith in an ordered universe. Without an ordered universe, obviously, there will be no scientific patterns. It requires a belief in objective truth. If there is no truth, what's the point in doing science, trying to discover the truth? And it requires a belief that your human senses and reason are functional. So all of these are presuppositions that you've got to believe already before you can start doing science. What about Christianity? Well, Christianity's purpose is more to know how to live. Method, revelations and miracles from God. What does it require in terms of presuppositions? It requires a faith in objective truth and my own senses, because the Bible does give some evidence to support it. But once again, as we could say, it requires a belief in God and a belief that He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. So some significant differences here, some similarities. They both require presuppositions. In fact, science benefits from Christian presuppositions because the presuppositions that are required to do science are within the Christian faith, within the Bible. And so you'll find that the more biblical societies, as opposed to just the more Christian ones, often have traditionally been quite scientific. Although, of course, there has been conflict between science and Christianity. But what else? The method is very different. The method is very different. And that's because the purpose is very different. So in the case of science, it's to know the truth about what things are and how they work. In the case of Christianity, it's to know the truth about how to live and why we should do things and why we exist and so on. So it's very, very different kinds of presuppositions and very different kinds of aims, purposes. So you can see comparing science and Christianity is a bit of an, some people say it's not apples and oranges. It's apples and coffee maker or something. Well, maybe, try eating a coffee maker, right? So if you want food, a coffee maker is not terribly useful, but a coffee maker is very sophisticated, and we can admire that and appreciate that as Christians as well. So there's this guy that got famous on YouTube, Simon Sinek, talking about this golden circle, this idea of the why, the how, and the what. And basically the premise of it is that we tend to focus on the what and the how, which would be science, but actually it's the why that's the most important. It's what motivates people the most, and if you get the why right, then the how and the what will more naturally follow. If you simply have the what and the how and you try to get a why from that, you'll have trouble. And that's, I think, why science has trouble trying to answer the big questions in life, because it's really a tool that is honed for the what and the how. Whereas faith and religion and philosophy are honed for the why, and that's why we get to better solutions in the whole of all the why and the how and the what, from when we start from a Christian or a religious standpoint and then try to understand by science. If you have the wrong religious standpoint, it should show up in the science, but that doesn't mean that you should exclude the religious standpoint when you do the science. That doesn't follow. So let me just give my own little myth, an illustration of what this might look like. So there's, once upon a time, there's a book, and this book contains every data that has ever been in existence. And here you see on the slide an example of what that data might look like. Just an example. So you see all these points along a chart, and this represents everything that ever happened. And there's two men, Professor Science and Pastor Christian, and these two men come to the book and they try to find the truth. They want to know the truth, and they have very different methods of going about it. Professor Science has a good method. He looks through the book and looks for all the most common occurrences, and he looks for patterns, he looks for trends, and in fact there are some other points that don't fit the pattern, but that's okay, because he already understands that you've got to exclude the outliers, as we say in science. And so the Professor Science also remembers another important point, which let me just touch on that quickly, and that is that God must be excluded. So any miracles, any kind of God must be excluded. And for example, it's like in a race, a crawling race, the baby that doesn't crawl properly is banned. So this is a funny news story when I look for unfair disqualification. This was one of the first ones that came up. So anyway, the scientist has disqualified anything that doesn't fit the trend, and so now he has a trend line, and this is a reasonable kind of trend line. He's excluded number 7, which you might have noticed is missing. And that's important, because if he included number 7, his equation would be ridiculously long, and it would be impractical for him to actually make trends, make predictions, understand the way that physical things work, the way that natural things work. And when it comes to making aeroplanes and mobile phones and other things that we rely on, cars and so on, it would become not very useful, the data that he's got. He needs to exclude those outliers, because that will create a reliable trend that can be used in engineering and so on, making all sorts of useful things. And now, Pastor Christian appreciates what Professor Science has done, and he says, oh, that's good. He likes to read about it. He likes to use the mobile phone and the plane and so on. But Pastor Christian has a difference between him and Professor Science. Pastor Christian doesn't want to exclude the outliers. So here's Pastor Christian's view.